Hi, this is Alpesh Doshi here. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the next generation of generative AI systems called agentic systems are going to take hold, and going to talk a little bit about what's called the agentic mesh and how that really is one of the constructs and frameworks and architectures that will help implement Gen AI and agents for benefit across most companies. Um, the important thing to remember is this is just the sort of progression of the way agents will become usable, scalable, and manageable within any company. And I'll describe how they work. So, one of the key things that we've seen in the last 3 years around Gen AI is that there's been lots of different uses around what are called co-pilots or wrappers, where you have a model and an interface. And we've seen many companies emerge. But also what we've seen is that the measurable impact and putting stuff into production hasn't really happened. Chatbots have really fallen short. They can answer stuff in isolation, but they can't really do anything apart from answer a question. Can't really coordinate work where you've got different elements of different systems and different processes working. You can't do that at the moment. And things like scale and safety. How do you deploy AI across functions and businesses and people? And one of the areas that we're going to talk about is what's called an agentic mesh. And what that is basically a fabric of interoperable tools and agents which do different things. And they have things like shared memory, so you can remember things across different agents. You have things like policy and observability to make sure these agents work properly. And it also does things like orchestration. So if you're running a workflow today in your process orchestration environment, one of the things that we'll do is agents will basically handle all the orchestration and the end-to-end workflows and be intelligent about how they work. So the thing to remember here is there's so many new different capabilities and new capabilities that are emerging, and we just need to think differently about them. So as an example, going back into what I'm saying here, where you can basically compose reusable capabilities and handle things like guardrails, which is about how do you make sure the inputs and outputs are valid and measured and governed properly. And so in short, it really is going to help firms implement new types of business infrastructure and enable the movement from a bot to integrated systems and the new tech stack. So the agentic mesh, this is just a bit of a diagram on agentic mesh. You can see some of the things here that you need as components. So now we'll go through some of these things. What you need is inputs, and those inputs could be data, could be knowledge graphs, could be policies and procedures, could be user goals and prompts. And in there you have agentic meshes, and you have tools, you have policies, configuration, and you have interfaces. Interfaces into an app at the front end. You may have interfaces into data sources or enterprise systems. And what you're trying to do is be able to build a system that can handle all of those things to then deliver a production grade system. So what is an agentic mesh? What it really is basically a modular governed network of agents that basically plan and coordinate and execute tasks and goals with a view to having shared context, access to tools, and the memory either as part of a particular agent or wider memory usage. And I'll go through all of those things in a bit more detail. Things like collaborative and intelligent is really important here. Agents will collaborate with each other and talk to each other as they're executing tasks. And they're intelligent because they can reason. They'll be able to reason and be able to know what to do depending on the inputs that you get and then the give outputs. So some of the key areas, as you can see here, are things like they're composable. So you can bring together these building blocks, and actually one of the things I'll talk about is how do you build the right granularity of agents? How do you create those building blocks that can assemble, and how do you do that in a way which brings together the right types of agents in the right kind of structure to be able to do complete work? They're observable. What we'll see is you'll be monitoring the things inside out. You'll have a whole set of new tools They'll observe what's going on, and real time. So if you're executing a transaction, you'll see them be able to monitor and do the activities, and obviously give alerts and warnings and all those kind of things too. They're going to have to be governable. So if they're not governable, how do you know what's going on? How do you manage them? And governance will happen automatically, but also potentially manually. And one of the nice, really exciting things is actually they're evolvable. As we move forward over the next 2-3 years, they will learn and evolve and learn to do things in a different way. So this is just a new kind of thing that will emerge. If you've done any kind of reasoning with Perplexity or a Chat GPT, you'll see some of the reasoning happen, and that's sort of the beginnings of evolving these agents to do what they could do in the future. And everybody talks about AGI. I don't think that's an AGI thing, but the idea is that you're getting through more intelligent systems and more intelligent agents that are gonna do more and more for us. So the thing to remember here is that agents aren't a monolith. It's not having a single model, and a model will be running all the different agents. What you really will have is different models and different contexts for different agents, because they do different things. So for example, if you're running a system in the finance department, you're not going to need the massive models to run finance processes. You'll probably have mathematical models, etc., that will run inside and run specifically for those specific use cases. So you'll build an agent stack which will handle finance processes, and obviously going back to the composability, you'll build multiple agents which will handle that. You'll have shared intelligence and have consistent context, because take the finance example, you'll have shared data and you'll need to have data across these agents, and the context of what's being executed, like let's say an order to cash process, and they will be able to understand those things and be able to have policies and rules that make sure that they do the right thing. Workflow is also important, and reliable handoffs is important. As agents are running, they'll be handing things to the next agent along, rate of results and coming back. So being able to do that consistently and be able to do that reliably is a really key part of that. And some of the biggest vendors like Google have already started creating protocols that enable that communication. And they should be governed and managed, and they'll expand and evolve over time. So you obviously have enterprise grade controls and oversight mechanisms to manage all of that. So, one of the things that we're going to see is that autonomous agents are going to become more and more popular. How to program those agents, and in this case we're saying a teammate. You'll have a teammate that works with you as an individual. Going back to finance, you may have a finance teammate that's going to go out and execute a bunch of things for you, and you'll be monitoring and managing that and potentially intervening in the transaction. I mentioned shared context. Again, it's understanding the overall goal and progress of something that's happening and the context that will be there to enable that collaboration between agents and sharing that information across agents. What you'll really have is tool sets. You'll have tool sets that will access external data, systems of record, and be able to have external tools and external data, and actually interact with systems, interact with your underlying CRM system or your finance system. And you'll be able to have an extensible tool set that will be real within an agent that will do integration and be able to execute things outside the agent domain and maintain context. And finally, persistent memory. If you can't execute an agent and have it do something and then save that, then what's the point, right? So agents will be able to retain and recall information and be able to bring that in as part of the execution of that particular agent, and potentially even do it dynamically. And it will be continuously learning and be able to react on a change in the environment, because a change in the environment may trigger a specific action. So just as a business view, what I'm trying to explain here is, how is this going to work? Each agent in the mesh, will have a distinct role, and that will potentially map to familiar business functions, and the ability to have specialization around what it's going to do and how it's going to do it, and be able to do that cleanly as well. so what will happen is that the system will operate with the coordination of a well-run team, and that team will be people and agents, and it will be able to have that automation, and without a doubt, the judgment of human expertise. Everybody says, "Oh, well, people are going to be redundant in a lot of these things." I think the role of individuals is going to change. So, if you look at some of the roles that here described here, a planner, that's just one example. A planner is a person whose job, together with agents and tools, is to translate a business request into a plan and acceptance criteria and success measures to be able to execute that agent to do what it should do. Specialists. So you'll have specialist agents, for example, that will run mathematical calculations or be able to do data processing and data transformation or language transformation. So the specialists will exist because their role will be just to really deeply understand a specific domain. Like you have an individual today who has deep understanding of a particular domain, an agent will have that as well. A reviewer will look at the whole picture and look at the output and the policies and compliance, and that will be in combination with an individual as well as an agent or agents, and make sure that the execution is happening under business standards within the company. And finally, an approver. What you're going to see over the next few years is that most things won't run automatically from the beginning. They will have an approval process. They'll have a risk assessment, and they'll have the ability to have transparency into the decisions that are being made by the agent, because frankly, that's a business problem. And in a regulatory environment, you absolutely need to have transparency on decisions. And so the being able to know what the decision was made, how it was made, is also important. So just an example of an end-to-end workflow, and if you were sitting, designing agents, what would it look like? Yeah, these are some of the sort of approaches you can see here. Just to sort of go through it very quickly. You can see here you have an intake. You've got a request that's come in. You've got to validate that the request is there. For example, using guardrails. There's no profanity or there's no breaking policies. There's no contravening regulations, and that context and domain will come in, and the granularity of the use case will be there to be able to say, I want to execute something. That will then translate into an execution plan. It may be one or more agents. Now, potentially that could be manual or it could be automatic. A lot of this will be a combination of both. You'll let the agent or the system go out and figure out what it needs to do, and you'll be able to just manage what's going on there. And that will have access to tools and to data as well. That will then do an execution. So they'll go out and execute, and that execution could be a second, or it could be hours, or even potentially days. And those tasks will be coordinated and performed, and you'll see the monitoring of the activities, and you'll be able to see what's going on. And if you design the agents correctly, you will see telemetry coming out on what the activities are doing, and potentially interfere and intervene and stop something happening as well if you didn't see that it was a valid output. Once that's complete, you'll be having quality and policy validation. You'll be having compliance and governance. So you're saying, hey, did this do what we want it to do? Is it compliant with our rules and guidelines? Is it compliant with law like the EU AI Act? And with enterprise policies. So all of these things in combination, which will be encompassed and embedded inside the agent infrastructure, but also in the governance around the tools to be able to execute. And that will deliver the output. That output could be many things. Output could be updating a database, executing a transaction. It could be giving an output on a user interface. It could be generating a report. It could be all of those things. And the important thing here is that it learns. It learns when it's doing it. When it learns something, when it's executing something, it can take that feedback and building the tools and the capability to feed it back in and say, hey, can I do this better? Can I do it differently? But also updating the context as well. You'll be updating the context of what happened as well to take account of that new thing that's happened. So what can it solve? Generally, it can solve many, many business problems, and it just takes the imagination and the innovation and vision to do that. And these are 4 things mainly in financial services that I'd like to just highlight. So, for example, if you're conducting research for an investment and risk, You could synthesize research. You could take all the client preferences by user experience with agents sitting underneath that to capture all the detailed client preferences. You could basically draft an output and advice checked in compliance, and do that all automatically, right? If you're doing hyper personalization, you'll be able to get those proposals and make them completely hyper personalized for that particular individual. Transaction monitoring AML, these are big problems within organizations, and transaction monitoring in a traditional sense is quite complex. A lot of the transaction monitoring AML work involves people making decisions because the systems can't make decisions because they're based on rules and databases and tick boxes. Because the agents can actually reason and you can constrain that reasoning, you could basically enable that automation, and be able to make sure that you're coordinating across, for example, regulatory filings that you may need to do as well, and do that automatically. Things like claims and policy servicing, that involves a lot of people today. You could automatically request missing info, go and use AI to find the info and fill it in. You could orchestrate straight through processing of a claim, and even automatically do the adjusting through something that adjuster does manually today, and be able to complete that claim relatively quickly. Finally, treasury and cash operations, forecasting liquidity. That, for example, could involve complex mathematical calculations, and use an agent which underneath has a model which is very specific to doing complex mathematical calculations and formulas, and be able to run that model too. You could initiate transfers and reconciliation. Those kind of things are really, really key. Today, recs and reconciliations take actually time and cost and delay, and potentially regulatory fines if you don't get it right. So all of these things are definitely ripe for change over the next few years. So what does a mesh look like? What are the key components of it? And these are some of the components here. What you have is things like the core platform, which handles all of the infrastructure, the identity, for example, identifying an agent, make sure it's the right kind of agent, making sure it's secure, making sure that that you're managing the cost for inference. Inference is when you do a prompt, or you ask it a question, that does inference. Inference could sort of run away. The cost could run away if you don't manage it properly. And the number of tokens going in and out is something that you would manage on the infrastructure, and therefore the cost you would manage on the infrastructure to make sure that you're optimizing the inference. And if you imagine running thousands and thousands of agents, if you don't optimize that could cost tens of millions, and it could run away before you know it. So the platform underneath, the foundational layer, provides those capabilities. Observability is another one, monitoring everything, having traces and metrics, and even evaluations. What is the agent doing? Is it doing what we think it's doing? And did it do what we think it did when it gives the output? So LLM and Agentic eval is a really important part, because in regulated industries, as an example, if you're running thousands of agents across all different parts of the business, each department, for example, may run multiple agents, and they will need to have multiple eval continuously of what the output is and what the input is, to make sure that it's behaving the way you expect it to, because you'll need to feed that into the regulator and regulatory reporting. Guardrails sit alongside that, where you're having critical safety measures for inputting and planning and outputs, to make sure that the inputs are correct and in line with governance, in line with policy, in line with regulation. And when the outputs come, you're measuring using guardrails to make sure the outputs are also valid and in line with policy, internal policy, but also in from a regulatory perspective, and being able to embed, for example, regulatory rules within the guardrails to make sure that the outputs are in compliance with those regs. The context fabric and the context engineering is a really important part. I mentioned earlier about data and being able to build an AI-ready data fabric. Without AI-ready data, you won't be able to do anything with an agent. And this is an emerging practice where you're building the context that will be fed into an agent. And there are many different types of data. We've already talked about systems of record, but you can talk about things like RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation, which actually converts raw data into data ready to be queried by a model. And that Retrieval Augmented Generation, there's about 50 plus different techniques. So which one do you use for which context, for which domain, for which use case is actually quite a interesting challenge. Things like having ontologies and knowledge graphs. If you're, for example, doing reg and compliance, and you are want to be compliant with 50 laws, 50 country, laws in 50 countries, building a knowledge graph and ontology allows you to bring that together with the model, together with the context and the use cases, and be able to actually make sure that you're compliant with what you should be. I talked a little bit about specialist agents, and those agents could be built internally, but you might even buy them externally. You might, for example, use an external search agent like Google or some other provider because they provide a specific search in a specific domain that's useful to you. You may access third-party data via an agent, which is providing, for example, trading data or static data or reference data. And then one of the biggest areas is orchestration. In our current world, you have orchestration tools, and those tools basically manually build a process, and you have orchestration, and it does it manually, and you have to build the orchestration in. Well, with this new world of agents, you'll have coordination agents, which will base their job is to coordinate across all the agents executing. And you'll have things like intelligent planners. So, planning the way that the actual task is completed. You'll have routers, routers that decide through business rules and through the orchestration in the agent decide, I'm going to do this or I'm going to optimize this in a particular way. And coordination is another important part when you've got, let's say, 10 agents executing and you need to coordinate between these agents on completing a task and be able to make sure that they're coordinating correctly to complete that goal or tasks. And one of the things that we as users want to see is a user-facing layer. Be able to see what's going on, be able to see the outputs. And you'll have traditional things like you'll have apps, but these apps will be built on top of agents. Those applications will look different and work differently, but the UX will be very familiar to us. Chat interfaces, which is what most people are used to, and those outputs that will still be there and will still interact with chat interfaces as well. And you might have APIs that are accessing third-party information too. So let me just talk a little bit about shared context. Without, I said it a bit earlier, I'll say it one more time. AI-ready data is really, really important. Without getting the right data together, an agent is useless because it doesn't know the domain, it doesn't know the context it's talking about. Yes, it might be intelligent in the model itself, but actually it doesn't really know what to do. So what you'll end up doing is building reusable work packs of data. So in today's world, in a data mesh architecture, one of the things people are building are what are called data products. So data products will combine into building reusable data work packs, which will enable you to bring that together in an agent, which will have things like definitions and policies and standards that the agents will draw from. Right? Part of this thing is, can you make it easier to create an agent? Well, you'll be able to find that, have the right version of information in the context. You'll be able to reduce rework. One of the things is when you're building the context, if you have to build it every time, then that's really expensive and really costly. Bringing the context together to reduce rework is really, really important. And you'll be able to bring that together and remove costly revision cycles and obviously the data quality inconsistencies. And use cases will be spun up really, really quickly, in days or in literally days, even hours, by simply connecting agents to the work packs and to the flow and to the agents. And so you won't have to build them from scratch. And in fact, what will happen is the agents will go and do that for you. You'll say, here's the particular piece of work that I want to do, and it will go and give you a recommendation on how to do it. And think of work packs as a really, really important part of the institutional knowledge of a company. So if you imagine if you work in a medium large enterprise, you'll have hundreds of thousands of documents and policies. Being able to find those and also to extract some from people's heads you can basically now codify them and be able to use them in the agentic mesh to complete the work that you want to do. I mentioned guardrails. Let me just sort of talk a little bit more about guardrails. You know, every organization demands clear boundaries, demands governance, demands control over what's input and output. And, you know, just to try and give a bit more depth in terms of how you would look at this, and this is not necessarily how you would look at it, but this is just an example of that. So you may allow low risk, you know, may have guardrails where they're low risk actions, and actually, you know, you don't want to interfere, and then the actions will be processed automatically, and the agent executes automatically within the defined parameters that you've already described. You might have a review bucket where you have medium risk agents where you need to have a trigger that's done by a human that they're going, yes, we'll do this, but you're managing through the guardrails and triggering it manually. And then the third and final one is high risk. You know, out of scope requests are basically prevented entirely, and those guardrails prevent you from doing the inputs and outputs. The important thing here is also that every decision is logged automatically. What the decision it made, when it made it, how it made it, what the trail of the audit trail of that, and you know it will answer that question: what happened and why. And the why is really important for regulatory environments. You know, so being able to do that allows you to be more confident that that the systems you're creating and automating can work well. So what does it look like? You know, we've seen over the last 2-3 years um, the level of automation, and frankly, there's very little at the moment. But different use cases demand different levels of automation. And what we've seen so far is really tier zero ones, where you have, you know, AI provides suggestions, recommendations, and you have a wrapper, and humans are making all the decisions and guiding the model, the LLM in this case, and you know, an agent chatbot is, you know, a chatbot is just in principle, an agent that has an interface that you interact with. And most, I would say 80 to 90, maybe even 95% of all things today are that tier zero, where you're manually controlling. Tier one is more automated. It does a lot more work, and reasoning models right now, the reasoning steps, if you've ever used any of these tools where it does reasoning, it completes drafts and analysis, and it can go away and take, you know, anywhere from 1 minute to 1 hour or 5 hours doing that, but you still have human approval on what it's doing, and being able to know what the output is. Tier two is basically it will automatically, it will go away, and it will handle low risk scenarios automatically, and if it finds something that's going to be triggered, you know, like a rule or a guardrail has been breached, then it will inform you. And then finally, automation. You know, there are so many tasks that don't really need human automation, and we've seen a lot of this in traditional software, but we'll see a hell of a lot more where humans were involved because there was no way of automating these things, and that will be a fully automated execution with audit embedded in, and they're, you know, mainly suited for well understood low risk and high volume processes. So most organizations start at tier zero and will graduate to higher tiers over time, as the systems become aware, as systems are trained up, as systems learn, and that will take time. That will take time over a few years. So, you know, there's some of the typical examples here that, you know, you can look at. You know, by using these kind of agentic systems, you know, you could reduce cycle time by an average of 60%. You know, if you're looking at a reg and compliance process, you could do that fairly straightforwardly, and that will save a hell of a lot of time and money and risk as well. You know, being able to have a significantly higher quality of outputs. So going from low quality outputs, a lot of rework, to 94% or more quality, more accurate outputs. And you know, a big one for financial services and other areas is policy breaches. You know, if you do this well and you have proper governance and proper tools, you can reduce policy breaches to zero. Now that's a bit ambitious, but you could. And the most important thing here is realizing savings. You know, you could reduce the costs of running your operation significantly if you go alongside, it's a lot. It's taking the systems, the processes, the context, the building the agentic mesh properly, and you can get massive efficiency gains and capacity creation, and actually generating new business opportunities. So there was a CEO of a Fortune 500 that said the mesh basically doesn't just make work faster; it makes governance visible, quality measurable, and scale achievable. And that's a really important part. Scale would be achievable. So, what do you expect? What can happen here? You get faster outcomes. You can and this is a financial services example specifically. You can automate workflows and execute them instantly without delays and human approval bottlenecks. It can optimize processes and keep optimizing them. And if you build it correctly, you can remove inefficiencies as well. You can standardize procedures and ensure that consistent high quality results um, are executed in regular workflows. Being able to have alerts and triage and investigations, you could basically reduce false positives by 30 to 50% if you thought about it. And risk control is definitely a big part of that. Being able to remove that need for um, manual risk controls, and you could automatically check complex policies and sign off automatically. Agents to do credit scoring and risk. Models can analyze customer data, evaluate creditworthiness automatically. And remember, this isn't based on rules. This is based on reasoning. So it's a different way of doing it. Today what you have is rules, and those rules have to be codified by hand, and then have to be managed. With the future, it's gonna be using inference, and it's going to be using automation and reasoning to work out what the right answer is. You'll have the ability to have external and internal agents. So you may have a specific, for example, use case around credit that is a very tiny, very specific lending that you're doing, and you may not have built the agent for that. You can go out and find one and use that instead. Yeah, so what we'll see is agentic systems being deployed, which have multiple specialized agents, and each can handle specific aspects of that process. So, as an example here, I mentioned, one agent might focus on real-time market data analysis, another on sentiment analysis, for example. Reg and compliance is another big one. Being able to have explainable AI to satisfy regulatory environments is a big part of that, and being able to use these kind of systems will be able to automate that, but also track and manage it. You can have proper governance frameworks which are codified and then can reason, and be able to answer the problems that you have and be able to govern that way, way quicker. So these are just a very, very small sample in the financial services domain where the art of the possible is absolutely phenomenal. So where do you start, right? The what I see all the time is this: what do we do and where do we start is definitely still a big part of this. What I've seen in general is people just don't know the art of the possible and what the breadth and depth of what you could potentially do. But that doesn't get away from proper program management, proper strategy and approaches. And these are sort of the 5-6 things that you need to do. You need to do the strategy and demand. How do you build a strategy on automation? What does that look like? How do you build a demand of these kind of agentic systems? That's still the same, right? You still got to work on that. People and ownership, that doesn't change, right? What it changes is how that ownership happens and the kind of people and the work that you do. You still have to do that work. You still need processes and standards. Those don't go away, but execution of processes may be automated. Still need to build those out. And frankly, you can use AI to do them. Build the standards with AI. Build your internal standards that help you gain competitive advantage. I mentioned content and knowledge and data. That's still one of the most under talked about elements around using AI and agents. Making sure your content, your knowledge is all processed and available to every single agent is quite a large undertaking. And it isn't just having a data lake or a lake house, it's actually doing a lot more work to build the context for every agent for that particular use case that you may be having in those agents. And that requires a hell of a lot of work to implement. Governance and risk doesn't go away. You still have to have governance risk, but what you have to do is you're going to have to modify how governance and risk is going to work. And throughout the whole process, you need measurement and impact. You need to measure everything around every single element of the process and make sure you measure the impact of the output and be clear on what those KPIs are up front so you can see whether you're being successful and seeing whether you're getting the results that you want in the time that you want with the cost savings or the efficiencies that you're looking for. So, common traps to avoid. What I've seen is, people talk about having 1 megabot for everything. However much these models are powerful, and they're amazingly powerful, whether it's Claude, whether it's OpenAI and ChatGPT and a bunch of the different models they have, or other providers, the reality is one model will never do everything. It definitely won't do everything in your context with your organization, with your data, with your IP, with your knowledge, with your ways of working. So there isn't a single solution for everything. There isn't a single model for everything. Doing one of the things that you will have to do is do a lot of eval, whether it's LLM eval or agentic eval, to understand which model works best for you in which agent and which use cases. And you need careful planning. Need careful planning and organization and structure and data science and computer science to build the right granularity of the agent and the models that you're going to use. A lot of things that people talk about is buying tools, and I've seen this before. People say, help me solve this problem, implement a tool and it will solve the problem. Actually, what you should be thinking about really is the operating model. Focus on the modernized operating model, and remember, think about the fact that agents are going to do a lot more stuff than you do, and it will change the way you actually build the operating model and execute it. You have to plan for this new kind of automation and new capabilities, of which there are many, in this environment. And scaling without shared context. No context, there's no specific outcome. You've got to build the context. You've got to build the data around that. And if you build that right, the agent will be successful. If you don't, you won't get the right answers, and you won't get the right goals that you're aiming for. And you've got to measure in the activity, right? When you measure activity but you don't measure in the outcome, that's definitely a big problem. You have to have an outcomes measured, and what you have to do is build those measurement frameworks and build those measurement frameworks and very clear on what the outcomes that you want, and be able to put everything together to do that. And those things are some of the sort of key highlights that I see to help drive successful delivery. So what do you do now, right? What is the things that you should look at to start to get on the road to this journey to leverage these kind of technologies? One of the things to look at is, look at some key workflows, where you've got speed and data integrity are important, and build something, try it out. Remember I talked about strategy, but honestly, if you do the work around getting an outcome and build something around that outcome, and you can build a chatbot, right? That's what most people are doing right now, is building a chatbot. What you really want to do is build automation. And the next point is that, build those autonomy, and don't be scared. What I see is people are a bit scared. Yes, there's risk, and you've got to build a risk tolerance in, but actually you can balance that innovation with control. You can try these things and innovate and control what's going on and be able to get some really amazing outputs. Definitely build a bunch of capabilities and standardized assets, and those, I mentioned work packs earlier as one example, and those things are really important to build as a foundation piece. That will help to drive through delivering some of the success that you need. And definitely implement tools that track and report impact. Those things are really important to know what's going on. Things are really important to see how successful you're being with executing these agents. And there's a whole set of new things that need to be built. One of the things I talk about is generative BI, replacing static, really difficult BI tools with generative BI, where you can personalize and customize every single report that you need. So thank you for listening. There's my LinkedIn card. please connect. When you do connect to me, um, just say you heard me on Digital Leaders or wherever you saw me, and I'd love to hear from you and get some feedback on the presentation. It'll be great to hear all of your comments, whether they're good or bad, and please reach out. I'll be love to talk to you. And thanks very much for listening. Thanks a lot.